So, part 2, segment 2 of lecture 2, MDA explained. Here's what the model looks like. The mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics model. Now, the big white box around it, which we've labeled milieu, we'll go into that in a second, but let's just break down this model first and talk about each part individually. So, mechanics. What are mechanics? What do you think of when you think of mechanics? Did you think of maybe how the game works, the different features, what the player can do? The one word synonymous definition that I like to use for mechanics is rules. Mechanics are the rules in the game. You could call them the logic, the scripts, the code, but really it's the rules. And again, it's what the player can do. So think about a mechanic. What mechanic in a game comes to mind that we could use an example? Did you think of jump? Almost every month, students come up with, yeah, jump. Jump is a mechanic. You're correct. Jump is a mechanic. And this is a perfect one to use because it's not just the mechanics that we choose, but it's also how we choose to implement them that is going to define ultimately the player experience that is the output of the whole system. So with jump as a mechanic, one, can you even jump in your game? There are realistic military shooters that don't allow jump because they don't want bunny hopping. And typically soldiers wearing a pack 100 pounds plus, they're not going to do a whole lot of jumping, period, but especially not during a firefight. But we see in many less realistic shooters a lot of bunny hopping and jumping because it gives a player an advantage. It's hard to hit somebody on a server with latency and lag and all of that stuff when they're jumping around like a crazy person. So in one particular realistic military shooter that I'm familiar with, we decided to remove jump altogether, and in place of it we had to implement a whole system of mechanics, a vault and mantle system, so that soldiers, when confronted with a waist-high obstacle, still had a way to get over it. We want it to be realistic. They're not going to jump up and land on it with both feet. They're going to put a hand down. They're going to mantle it and crawl up on it and get over it. It takes a little bit more time. We added vulnerability. We added the fact that you had to put your weapon down and you couldn't fire while doing it. All of these things actually introduced a lot of complexity into the mechanics, but it was worth it because that's the experience we were going for, a realistic feel of a soldier in the army. So with jump, assuming that we have a jump, how high would you jump? Do you jump knee high, waist high, head high, 3 times player height? You can see where how you implement this jump mechanic, it's going to affect the experience. You know, if I'm jumping 3 times player height, I'm probably playing a game like Mario or some kind of platformer where jumping is a big part of clearing obstacles, avoiding enemies, killing enemies, etc., solving environmental puzzles. Imagine what Mario would be like, or any of your side-scrolling platformers, if you could only jump a realistic height. It would definitely affect the experience. So that's my example for jump, and we can apply this across the board with many different mechanics. You just got to remember, it's what the player can do. If we were to give a non-video game example and take, say, the rules of getting a first down in American football. Now, there are a lot of mechanics, there's a lot of rules that occur simultaneously beyond just the first down. However, getting a first down in American football requires a team to move the ball 10 yards from the original line of scrimmage in 4 downs. 10 yards from the original line of scrimmage in 4 downs. Now, what it doesn't tell you is if it's 4th down and long, if it's 4th down and say 10 yards or more, that what is your team actually going to do? They're going to punt. but that's not in the rules. This is actually a dynamic. Dynamics are what the player actually does. Mechanics, what the player can do. Dynamics, what the player actually does. The one-word synonymous definition for dynamics would be behaviors, player behaviors. What we witness the player, observe the players doing, what they actually do when given the mechanics. Now, we as designers, we'll stop for a minute and point out the fact that the designers have an arrow going right down into the mechanics on this slide. That's because, as designers, that's all you can touch. You are only allowed to touch, affect, change, manipulate, update, patch, release, nerf the mechanics. You can't actually touch the dynamics. That is out of your hands. And it's a weird question to ask, but what would it look like if a designer tried to skip the mechanics and go directly to dynamics? Think about it for a second. I know it's hard. I'll pause for a second and see what you come up with. So, yeah, the question was, what would it look like if you tried to skip the mechanics and go right to the dynamics? It's hard to think about, but imagine if you were a moderator of a server and you just said, hey, players, you shouldn't play that way. Or you posted in the forums, there's this known exploit in, the loot cave of Destiny. Please don't exploit it. What do you think that would actually do to the player behaviors? Do you think that the players would change just out of the goodness of their hearts because you asked them to? Absolutely not. In fact, if you were to post the fact that there was an exploit in something called the loot cave, I bet you even players that weren't exploiting it before would go seek it out and seek to exploit it. Players do not like to be told how to play. It's their game, it's their experience, they want to make their decisions. You have to be more subtle with those decisions, with affecting those decisions by how you implement the mechanics. So here's another example. Imagine an arena shooter. Here are the mechanics. It's an arena shooter, 32 players, every man for themselves, and it's in the actual Colosseum, the Roman Colosseum, an arena with marble pillars and stone structures and walls all around the edges, and absolutely nothing in the middle. Given those mechanics, given that level setup and those rules, what do you expect the player behavior to be? Probably nobody's going to go into the middle. Everybody's going to camp around the outside of the Colosseum where there's cover, wait for somebody to poke their head out or stray into the middle and snipe them. And if you're going for a sniper elite kind of player experience, maybe that's what you're going for. Great. Remember, I'm not going to say that any tool is good or bad. It's how you use these tools. So if you want that type of turtled up, slow moving camper experience, this is a good idea as far as your mechanics go. However, if I wanted to change the player behavior, if I wanted to change how players interact, because in an arena shooter, a death match, I kind of want some shooting and some death. That's the player experience that we're going for. We want to drive players into these areas where they're going to have these interesting conflicts, these interesting encounters, and either be successful or allow another player to be successful by taking them out. So what about this? I'm just going to change one mechanic. At the beginning of the round, and say once every 5 minutes, a power-up spawns in the middle of this arena, and whoever collects it does 10 times damage while invulnerable for 30 seconds. Now, what is the expected dynamic? Yeah, at the beginning of the round and once every 5 minutes or thereabouts, you're going to have a bunch of people charging the middle for that power-up. Just one little tweak to a mechanic and we completely change or flip the dynamics upside down and have people rushing for the middle where before nobody would go into the middle for fear of being taken out. And companies do this all the time. Epic is fantastic in Unreal Tournament. And in Call of Duty, Battlefield, any of your multiplayer shooters, they put the best weapons and the ammo and the power-ups and the strategic locations where it will drive players to have these interesting encounters, interacting with the power-ups, the weapons, the level, and of course the other players. So mechanics, what the player can do, the rules; dynamics, what the player actually does, their behaviors. So moving on, actually before we move on, I'd be remiss if after talking about dynamics, I didn't at least give a nod to unexpected dynamics. Unexpected dynamics. And to that, I'm going to reference this game right here, Moonbase Alpha. So Moonbase Alpha is a game that I was personally involved in. I was the high-level concept designer. So I designed the basics of it, and then we passed it off to another team to develop. In this case, it was the Virtual Heroes team. And when they developed it, because the game relied so heavily on teamwork and communication, because that's what NASA wanted. This was a serious game to interest middle school, high school aged boys and girls in a potential future career in aerospace. They really wanted it to require teamwork and communication. And when making a decision for the mechanics to implement to allow this experience, they chose to implement a third-party text-to-speech system where anything that you typed into the chat box was read aloud by a Microsoft Sam-like voice, so that just in case somebody didn't have a microphone or somebody wasn't watching the text box, that important communication could still be conveyed. So that was the intent. Great. That was how we expected the mechanics to be used. But if you're familiar with this game or what ensued afterwards, it was very unexpected, the dynamics that we got. So I'm going to link these in the chat if you want to watch them yourself. Otherwise, we are going to go ahead and go through them here. For the recorded video, I'm going to pause. I'm going to let you watch them on your own. By the way, explicit content warning. I do not condone the language or the sentiments in these videos. Neither does Full Sail University, but it really gets the point across as to what can happen if you are not really watching the dynamics as well as just the mechanics that you're implementing. So if you are easily offended by profanity, blasphemy, obscenity, or vulgarity, don't watch these videos. Otherwise, enjoy.